So in the previous set of exercises, we developed a tool to help us explain the drivers of growth on the supply side. We looked at historical data, and that gave us a nice perspective on where we have been and where we are now. But there's a critical question that we also have to ask, and that's, where are we going? Now, at several other junctures in this course, in various sectors, we'll be making forward-looking assessments. And in some cases, these assessments will depend critically on our forward-looking view of growth. So we're going to have to take a view on growth in the coming years. We're thinking about our growth decomposition, and this is your familiar decomposition. But instead, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making assumptions, and very often we make an assumption, you could call it a forecast, about output. And then we might even go a little bit further and say, well, here's what we think is going to happen to capital, and here's what we think is going to happen to labor, to employment in coming years. So the first thing that you have to ask is whether these future values are sort of consistent with the past, if there's a very sharp break, or if things seem to be going on smoothly, if they're supported by other analyses, and at the end of the day, if they're realistic, if they're not too optimistic or too pessimistic. Now, the other thing that I want to remind you is that if you get a forward-looking assessment of output, and you take a view on capital and you take a view on labor, then implicitly, you will have taken a view for total factor productivity. And this is the most important thing, because it may be the case that given your forward-looking assessment for these variables, output, capital, and labor, we may be getting an implicit value for total factor productivity that's unrealistic. In many cases, that assessment is too optimistic. We spoke to an expert analyst for country X, not an official, but an expert who gave us his view regarding economic growth in country X for the next several years, approximately 5 years. Now, you'll be looking at a similar kind of assessment that was prepared by a country expert for Diagnostica, but we'll get to that. Right now, let's look at country X. This country X analyst has been telling me that in the coming years, the average rate of economic growth is going to be, on a per-worker basis, about 3.7% per year. And we're going to see that that's slightly higher than what we had in the past, and I'm going to show you how to do that calculation, because here we have 3.7 here, and we're going to compare that to the most recent period, and we're also going to compare that to the whole period. And you can see that we have other similar calculations here in the spreadsheet for that. He told me, for example, that with a better investment climate, the capital stock will grow at a somewhat higher rate than previously, about 5.7%, again, on an annual basis. Unfortunately, he was unable to give me a detailed spreadsheet to support that assumption, so we'd have to assume that they use the perpetual inventory method, just like we did, and that they have good calculations. Regarding labor, we see that the analyst speaks of that they're moderating their expectations for employment growth. They believe that the increase in the labor force participation that they saw in recent years will simply not keep up. So we're expecting employment growth of 0.7% per year, just like the previous period. And in my opinion, that seems like a reasonable and prudent assumption, not too optimistic or not too pessimistic. But here's a question that we have to ask in order to understand their perspective even more. Even if their assumptions for capital and employment are on target, is there any way we can assess whether the overall growth rate is optimistic or pessimistic? Is our analyst being realistic? Is there any way that we might perform a reality check? Well, in order to do that kind of reality check, we can back out total factor productivity growth, just like we did for the historical numbers. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to return to my spreadsheet, and you'll remember that what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate capital growth on a per worker basis, okay? So there we are, and we can see that capital growth on a per worker basis is much higher than the previous period, and it's also somewhat higher than historical. But now I'm going to calculate TFP, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to take average output growth per worker minus, and let's go up here and get that guy, and let's multiply that by capital growth per worker, and we get TFP growth of 2.2%. So now I'm going to share with you some of my judgment. It seems that this number is higher than the historical average, and you can verify that here. It looks to be even more than what we saw in the most recent period. In fact, in country X, TFP has been coming down. I know that in the early years, big things happened. The country was industrializing and still implementing new and more productive technologies, and it's also true that they did some important reform measures during the earlier periods. But as time moved on, things seemed to be slowing down. So one might say that in order for this forward-looking assessment to pass a reality check, we would probably have to have a good reason as to why we think that TFP will be speeding up again. And quite candidly, I'm not sure I found that reason. That's why, in my final analysis, I'm being a little skeptical about this assessment. So I think the big message here is that growth accounting, when applied in a forward-looking context, can be a great reality check. We'll be asking you to do the same kind of reality check for Diagnostica. As part of your assessments, you're going to be computing some numbers just like we did here, but then in a poll, we'll be looking for your judgment. We'll be asking you to take a view on whether you find the diagnostic analyst's expert opinion to be too optimistic, too pessimistic, or just about right. So thanks so much.